today marks Media Freedom Day in South Africa. It's a day when newspapers were closed down and editors arrested in 1977 by the apartheid government. It was part of a bigger crackdown on the independents, the politicians, and particularly the black consciousness movement at the time. William Bird is the executive director of the organisation Media Monitoring Africa. William, good afternoon to you. I'm going to start with a broad question, if I may. How would you describe the state of our media, South African media, in the year 2020, post-COVID-19?
Hi, good afternoon, Stephen. Well, on some level it's looking good, and on another number of other levels it's looking pretty bad. So pretty good to the extent that we've got a relatively high level of media freedom in South Africa, which is something we can't take for granted. It's pretty bad to the extent that, you know, like everyone else in our country, the economy has been hit hard, and our media are no exception to this. So a number of our media organizations are really struggling. We've seen significant numbers of smaller media having to fold, and critically for even the biggest newsrooms, we've seen them drastically cutting the number of journalists. So when you cut journalism at a time when we need journalism more than ever, that can only be a very bad thing for democracy. It might make some level of business sense, but it makes the most awful difference to democracy.
I would like to suggest, and obviously I can hardly be objective, I'm in the media and we're doing this interview in the media, but as someone in the media, someone who likes to support it, I'd like to suggest that the pandemic has possibly shown how important independent interrogatory journalism is. I would suggest that government has possibly learnt that it is trusted more when it is questioned around something like a COVID-19 during literally an emergency, a national disaster. And as a result, more people were going to wear face masks and stay at home than would have been if there hadn't been proper independent journalism.
Look, there's no doubt, you know, so one of the most singularly positive aspects to come out of this awful period is that it has served to highlight the critical role of media in a democracy. I mean, we've always known that you can't have a democracy and without credible journalism. Like they just can't exist. The one can't exist without the other. And to that extent, this crisis has shown not only that government's messages are going to be trusted more when they are critiqued, but that having an open process that's transparent means that people are more likely to believe you, because they can go and they can check and they can verify. So there's no doubt that you know, credible quality journalism benefits democracy, and ultimately it benefits all political parties and politicians.
A few years ago, I mean, say 15 years ago, so more than a few, there were big fears that government would try and close down media organizations. There was the Protection of State Information Bill, for example, that people would be put in jail. People were talking about a media appeals tribunal. All of that seems to have gone away actually quite quickly.
Yeah, and I think we should be delighted about the fact that it has seemingly disappeared for now. Of course, what we know is that the new trends of shaking things up is that you no longer have to go along with your big thugs to try and threaten people. Now you just use social media strategies that can be implemented from pretty much anywhere in the world. And you don't even have to have any kind of claim of liability for it, you know. So to a degree, things are a lot better, but they're also a lot worse. So we've seen, for example, this rise of this xenophobic and Afrophobic hashtag, and you have to kind of wonder, well, where's this stuff coming from, and who's actually driving those conversations, and who's really behind them? And that's where I think the new battleground for media freedom is going to lie. Not so much from the threats from government regulation, because the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that it doesn't work for this kind of thing, but that the new lines are going to come from how we deal with and combat disinformation. And again, for that, it's in all of those major stakeholders' interests that we do succeed in ameliorating the impact of disinformation.
We're seeing, I mean, to pick up your point about social media, we're seeing, and this is something that started in the United States, where both Facebook and Twitter are based. We've seen a sort of public demands, and backed up by corporations in some cases, for them to actually do some fact-checking. And I mean, it's quite an immense thing for a social media organization like Twitter to do this, to label a tweet by the President of the United States as fake or as false. Are we going to see more of that, do you think? There's going to be more pressure on these social media organizations to actually label falsehoods as falsehoods, lies as lies?
Look, there's no doubt, you know, there's been this gradual kind of move. There's been their nonsense defense to a large degree that oh, they want to allow, maximum freedom of expression, and that kind of thing is just really counterintuitive, because it says you should allow all things, but actually we already don't. In a constitutional democracy, not just anything and everything goes. You have very broad ambits of freedom of expression and freedom of speech in South Africa, but there's certain things, like we know you don't want to use the K word like that. As a society, we've agreed this is not acceptable. Similarly, we've said things like child sexual abuse material are not acceptable, and this is really the kind of new boundary for determining where those areas lie, to say this kind of thing is acceptable and this kind of thing isn't. And when people go out and deliberately manipulate in order to disinform, that kind of thing, I think we're saying, works against democracy, and it's speech that should be and appropriately sanctioned.
There are a lot of journalists on social media. I may not be very popular among them for asking this, but it's become quite common for people, and I've done it many, many times, to go onto Twitter and express an opinion. Is that something that I should stop doing?
No, not at all. I think that's what we're seeing now increasingly is an awareness and acceptance that journalists too are people, and that they have their own views and opinions, as long as they're clear about those things and that they don't then impact the way that they report. And critically, that you differentiate your opinion from what is actually being a reported story. So it's well and fine for you to say, I think that these and these things are the way that our politics should unfold, as indeed you do in writing for Daily Maverick, for example. But that's a very, very different thing from then being able to go and say, oh, well, in this video you're showing now, the police didn't actually beat those people. The police were in fact running away from hoodlums who were chasing the police. That's a very different kind of a line to tread. So it's about being transparent. It's about saying these are the views and this is the way it's done. But these are the standards we adhere to when we report on the news. And if we find in violation of those, you need to take action, report us to the BCCSA or to the Press Council, whichever is the appropriate body.
William Bird, thanks very much indeed, Director of Media Monitoring Africa. Really do appreciate the time here.